For this assignment, I am going to send you a poem along with some suggestions as to how to approach this poem, and then you are going to analyze it and then present it to me in an essay of 2 to 3 pages. What I want you to do for the essay is identify the techniques that the poet has used, the specific things that the poet has included in the poem, the way that they have written the poem, and just don't identify it. Don't just say, hey, I saw alliteration in there. Tell me how the alliteration contributed to the meaning of the poem. The fact that it had lots of S sounds in there made me think of a snake. Okay. Now, here's an example of poetry analysis. An Emily Dickinson poem. Now, not even thinking about her biography or any of the other information like that. I'm just going to go straight at the poem and just look at author's skill here. And the first thing I notice is that Miss Dickinson has capitalized a lot of words in here. Poets will do that to draw your attention to certain words that they think are more important. Secondly, I've also noticed there's a lot of words I'm not familiar with. So, to get through this, I look up these words. I try to understand why she chose these words. Sometimes I knew the meaning of it, but I looked it up anyway because I found out, whoops, this has several meanings and I'd forgotten about one or never even knew about this meaning. And it does affect how I read the poem. So I looked up words like Sabbath, which is the day of rest for Jews and Christians, a bobolink, a common songbird, a chorister is someone who sings in a choir, a dome, a circular vault as a roof or ceiling, usually on fancy churches. Surplus, I wasn't too familiar with this one. I thought surplus, I was thinking like surplus, like having extra. No, a surplice is a loose-fitting, broad-sleeved white vestment, or like a gown kind of thing, worn over the clothes of a clergy person. And usually you see people in the choir wear them a lot. A sexton is an official of the church that takes care of the building and rings the bell to bring people to the church for services. And tolling, now I knew the tolling of the bell means that the bell is being rung. Okay, well, why couldn't you just said ringing the bell? So I looked up what tolling meant and found out, oh, that's right, I forgot. A toll is also a fee. Like when we're going through the harbor tunnel or something like that, I have to pay a toll. So that's interesting that you ring the bell and you have to pay. There's a payment for going to church implied in this. Okay, so getting all those words in there gave me a little bit more of an idea. I also noticed that Dickinson has a comparison going on here. She's comparing church and home. She establishes that right there in the first 2 lines. Some keep the Sabbath going to church. I keep it staying at home. Okay, so she's going to be showing you 2 different ways to do this. She stays at home with a bobolink, a singing bird, for her chorus, and she has an orchard of trees for her dome. Some keep the Sabbath in surplus, so they wear their fancy robes. I just wear my wings. So she thinks she's somewhat angelic, or is she just talking about her bird singing? Not sure there. And instead of tolling the bell for church, so instead of having to pay to go to church, her little sexton sings. Oh, okay. So her little sexton doesn't go up and ring the bell. Her little sexton's a bird that just sings to her. God preaches, a noted clergyman. Do we really want preachers? Do we want sermons? No. She just wants to experience God in her everyday life. She doesn't have to go to church on Sunday to be reminded how to live a good life. So she says in her last 2 lines, remember the last 2 lines always give us the meaning. So instead of getting to heaven at last in the end, I'm going all along. So she's really saying what she thinks is the difference between church and her faith. You go to church, and what happens? There's a minister, there's a priest, there's somebody up there that tells you what you must do if you want to go to heaven, how to live a good life, how to do what God wants you to do. Well, part of the problem with many of these churches is that they assume that you don't understand how to read the Bible yourself, that you can't interpret this information for yourself. And while it's not as bad today, there was a time where the churches were pretty corrupt, and they just wanted your money, and they manipulated their clergy. I'm sorry, their what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think. The people who go to church, the congregation. I knew it began with C. They manipulated their congregation. There's a lot of people who are holier than thou types who go in and judge other people. Didn't God or Jesus say, "Judge not, lest thou be judged"? And yet we've got a lot of people that do this. So she's saying, I don't need all this nonsense. I don't need the politics. I don't need all the crazy people judging me. I'm with God. I can go out into nature and listen to the birds and look at the trees, and I'm an intelligent person. I can figure this out for myself. And I live every day like it was the Sabbath. So she gets all this meaning across. Read it out loud, too. When you read the poem out loud, you hear the rhythm, you hear the meter, you hear the rhyme scheme, and that gives you a feeling. When you read this one out loud, you get kind of a positive feeling from it, so you know that this isn't a negative one. She's not really trying to condemn the church so much as she's just trying to say, I'm happy with the way I'm doing things. Okay, so you don't need to bother me. You don't need to come and yell at me for not going to church. In fact, she probably wrote this in response to her father or her brother or sister who were like, you don't go to church anymore. So, we look at things like that. Notice also I looked to see if there's any alliteration, assonance, personification, any of those terms that we talked about in an earlier slideshow. I also looked at her life. Now we think about her biography a little bit. And she lived in Amherst, Massachusetts, which was a very strict society. These are the people who are the descendants of the Puritans, and while maybe not as crazy as the Puritans were about things, they still believe they have the answers, they know the way. And so she got very frustrated. She would go to many different churches. As soon as they popped up, she'd go and check out a new church, and she'd always come home disappointed because it was always these people trying to tell her what to do. She was a very intelligent woman. She could read the Bible and understand it for herself, and she disagreed with a lot of what these people were saying. I don't remember seeing that anywhere in the Gospels. You're telling me I have to do these things. She wrote in her diary, it was her greatest pleasure to commune alone with the great God, and felt that he would listen to her prayers. She didn't need a priest to intervene to take her prayers up to heaven. It's one of the things about the Catholic Church. You talk to the priest then sends it off to a saint, the saint takes it to Mary, Mary takes it to Jesus, Jesus takes it to God, and then it goes back to... complicated, isn't it? You know, why can't it just be between you and God, is what Dickinson was saying. So we look at some of the things that went on during her life and get some ideas there. She was well educated and she was well read in literature, so she was capable of really thinking for herself. She was a very independent thinker and didn't want people guiding her. So all these things will come into my essay when I go to write it. Now the hard part here is trying to organize. How do you want to approach it? You may want to start with the biographical. You may want to save that for later, depending on how much the poem really is influenced by their life. With this one, I would probably start with the biographical because that leads into the poem. But with some of the poems you guys are getting, you may think that the way the poem develops, it's kind of better to go to the biographical after you've analyzed it. This is a personal decision. There's no right or wrong here. But when you do analyze the poem, you stop and think about, the first thing you really want to do is just tell us the general meaning of the poem. Then you go into the specifics. And then how you organize it from there is up to you. You may want to start off by saying, why are these words capitalized? There are words with special meaning that I need to examine, and you will explain those to me. You may want to talk about the rhyme scheme and the sound of the poem when you read it out loud. So you pick and choose how you think it flows best. So it's probably going to take several attempts to get this essay written before it sounds right to you. Okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me.